Welcome to Better Sex, where you get the information and inspiration to create and enjoy your best possible sex life. Join your host, sex therapist Jessa Zimmerman, as she brings you expert guests, helpful tips, knowledge, and strategies to improve your intimate relationships. And now, your host, Jessa Zimmerman.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jessa, and I'm so happy you're here for this episode of Better Sex. I've dedicated my professional life to helping couples enjoy a fulfilling, intimate life. I believe that sex is important. Our connections to other people matter, and we're not living our life to the fullest if we aren't connecting emotionally and sexually with our partner. That's why I'm here, bringing ideas and information to help you live and love better. Today, our topic is grief. Grief and sex. What do those two things have to do with each other, you might wonder? Or, maybe you don't. If you've suffered a loss that affects your sex life, maybe you understand full well why grief and sex would go in the same conversation. I got to become a sex therapist after hearing a sex therapist talk about her work as being grief and loss work. It really hit me how much people suffer when their sex life isn't working. That's why I'm doing what I do. So it's a topic that comes up all the time. There are the big losses, of course, like the loss of a spouse or the permanent loss of some sort of sexual functioning or body part that happens. But there are a lot of smaller losses that happen that really affect people. So there are losses with just changes in functioning and having to adapt. I hear people talk about loss with having to give up the idea that their partner just knows what they want. People struggle with loss as they get older and their libido changes. They don't want sex the same way they wanted it before, or now it sort of seems like work and it didn't when they were younger. All of this stuff is loss in real life, and it's important that we know how to grieve that and deal with that so we can move on and create, a sex life that we can look forward to and enjoy for the rest of our lives. So today I have a very special guest. Edy Nathan is a licensed clinical social worker and an AASECT certified sex therapist. And she specializes in grief, trauma, and sexuality. So Edy interweaves her formal training as a psychotherapist with alternative ways to tap into the self and truth. And within the context or the range of sexuality, trauma, abuse, and death, she believes that everybody experiences grief throughout their lives. And she also believes that you can't talk your way out of that process of grief, loss, or trauma. You need to find a way into the self to get to relief. So enjoy the conversation with Edy Nathan. So thank you, Edy, for being with me today. I'm so glad you're here.
I am too. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. So I wanted to give you a chance to just talk about grief in general and how you view it, I guess, before we launch into talking about how it's relevant to sex.
Okay, that sounds perfect. People often associate grief with just the loss of a loved one. And certainly that's a big part of the conversation within grief and the context of grief. But grief is really an even bigger conversation. It hits us throughout the life cycle. It hits us developmentally when we leave our mother's side. It hits us when we have a first love and our hearts are broken. It hits us during our first illness. It hits us as we age. So it really, just for anyone who's listening, understand that yes, it is the loss of a loved one, but that the overarching theme of grief affects us in so many ways, and it's something that we often don't talk about. We might label it as something else, but really it's grief that's really going on.
Yeah, it makes me think of, it's almost like I want to say capital G grief and small g, like we do with capital T trauma.
Yes, you know what? That's really interesting because I have a book that's going to be coming out soon, and it's called It's Grief, and the dance of self-discovery through trauma and loss. And I talk about the big G's and the little G's.
Okay.
Have the big G's, and the big G's, certainly, loss of a loved one, But for some women, a big G might actually be menopause. And for some men, a big G might be a diagnosis of diabetes that affects their sex lives. So it's not for me to say what a big G is to anybody who's listening to this, but certainly we have big Gs and we have little Gs. And,
yes, absolutely.
Right? And the accumulation of little Gs, if they're not dealt with, guess what? They turn into a big G. So, yeah.
Yeah, if they're all in a certain arena or something too, that would add up, I would imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the way my clients talk, a lot. There is so much loss, and it's not usually the big G stuff. It's small things about, not wanting sex the same way they used to, or needing more stimulation than they used to, or, just the changes that happen.
Yeah, the changes, the sexual changes, I'm so glad that we're having this discussion, Jessa, because those changes are really not discussed, very frequently, and they're not looked at as maybe part of a grief cycle. And, we are learning about ourselves throughout the life cycle. And if we had a certain kind of desire, a certain level of desire, if we were able to turn on quickly, and now all of a sudden you're in your 30s or your 40s or your 70s, and that turn on is a real different turn on, or maybe your desire is flat. There is such immense grief, especially if who you were was tied into you being a sexual being. And that's not for everyone, but for some folks, it really is. And
right.
Yeah. So to have this discussion is really important.
It's interesting, though, because I'm thinking a lot of the people I talk to not only do they not recognize it as grief, but it almost seems to me they come in feeling like they're broken. Like something's really wrong with them. And I maybe that's a stage before recognizing that it's a loss that they can grieve.
Yeah, maybe. And, I heard you, call it stage. And I guess I like to think of what we go through in grief as we go through phases. And the reason I like phase is because a stage is kind of like a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think that when we're grieving, there is no necessarily a beginning, a middle, or an end. It's actually far more fluid than that. And in this fluidity, when the fluidity of our sexual beings get interrupted, we don't have a language around it. So when you speak to the fact that your clients come in and they seem just broken, there's no language for, I'm grieving the loss of being able to have an orgasm, or I've never been able to have sex because it's painful and it hurts. And I'm angry, but I wouldn't call that grief. But when you start to talk about it as it relates to grief, all of a sudden, what I've learned with my own clients is they now have a texture to communicate what's going on. They have a language around it. And that sense of being broken, kind of gets illuminated. And they're no longer stuck in that sense of feeling broken.
Right. Well, in some ways, you already answered the question I came into the show with, which is, why are we talking about grief when it's a show about sex?
Yeah, that's right.
Which is sort of,
you got it.
tongue in cheek, because I know how much people are suffering losses,
yes,
in their problems. So it doesn't surprise me.
Absolutely.
But how does it show up, do you think, for different people? I mean, we've named some examples already, but talk a little bit more about what kinds of losses people have that are impacting their sex life.
So, of course, the obvious is, loss of a parent, child, or partner can affect, one's desire. It can just flatline your desire because you're grieving the loss of people you have loved. And, desire can often decrease, when you've lost someone. On the other hand, there are some folks who the way that they deal with loss is they're hungry for sex, and all they want to do is pacify the brokenness, that sense of the depths that they are in, by having human contact. And I don't even know if they're present. And my clients will often report, I'm there and I'm not there, but at least they're making some kind of contact. So, that's kind of an obvious. But
yeah,
in other arenas, it can be illness like cancer or treatments for cancer, sexual abuse, physical abuse. These also impact one's sex life and one's ability to open themselves up, open their bodies up, to intimacy, to communicating with their partners in terms of what they want, what they desire. And part of the communication, because I'm really not a big communications person around sex, I really like to talk about how does someone know themselves. And the process of grief actually enables a person to get to know the self. And it is through grief that they can often learn how they react. Are they more over distanced, which means that, they kind of stay away from their emotions and they're rather numb? Or are they under distanced, like hysterical? And the more one can learn about their emotions and how they filter those emotions, they then have that conversation with the self, and that conversation illuminates them into a conversation about sex, finances, desire, hunger, passion.
So, I mean, the way you're talking about it, grief is an opportunity.
Yes.
As well as something that maybe is devastating.
Yes.
But it
Yes.
really is a window in.
It is. It's a window in. Perfectly said. And there is one group that I would really like to just tap into, touch upon for just a moment.
Sure.
People with disabilities. They are often a group that is rarely spoken of. And just because someone has a disability doesn't mean they have no sexual desire. And for many folks with disabilities, they have fewer options and outlets for their desires.
Yeah.
And this lack of opportunity actually creates a huge grief reaction. And that reaction can look like anxiety, it can look like depression, it can look like melancholia. Within that population, it can look like anger or rage. And what they've found is that if this group, these people with disabilities, have a chance to be touched, and not necessarily even in sexual ways, even through massage or just having their faces touched or their heads touched, that they actually their rage reactions, their melancholia actually lessens to a large degree.
That's making me think too that there's a difference between loss. I mean, people that are disabled may have been that way from the very beginning.
Yes.
Right. So it's not like they've suffered a loss from something they used to know.
Correct.
And yet they still have grief.
Right.
So to separate out the idea that things happen to us that cause grief, but there's also things that we've always known.
That's right. But and to your point, so it's external circumstances, and then the internal, the natural circumstances, what we come in with. Yeah. Very much so.
So you've talked a little bit about, I mean, you're hinting at this a bit, but what does grief look like? What are the ways people manifest it? And I guess I was thinking too, how do we recognize if we're struggling and we don't know that, or our partner is struggling? Like, what are the various things that could be mistaken as something else?
And this is a very fine line that we're talking about, because, depression can look like so many different things and can be caused by so many variables. I tend to like to look at grief at, kind of breaking it down into three pieces, the physical, the mental, and the psychic. And, what goes on within our psyches or our souls, and how does what happens within our psyches, what happens within our souls actually affect our spirits. So, physically, can be exhausted, apathy, a lack of energy, no desire. And what can also happen physically, and again, it depends on the person and their history around, sex, sexuality, if there's been any previous trauma, but perhaps they're not getting aroused in the same way, and that can really cause grief, okay? Or they're bored.
Yeah.
They're bored with their partners. Maybe they're really bored with themselves. And again, I will always ask someone, I want you to look at yourself first before you look at your partner, before you start to say it's his or her fault. Let's look at the self. How what's not being inspired within you, within your own self. For men and women, but men especially, when they are diagnosed with heart disease or diabetes, and again, this is physical,
right?
Their drive is greatly affected, or their ability actually to get an erection, maintain an erection, is greatly affected. And, men and women will often think of themselves as sexual creatures. And for a man, when he's not able to perform, or for a woman when she's not able to get aroused or have an orgasm or be orgasmic when she used to be, this creates grief and a sense of loss. So mentally what happens is, again, there's depression, there's melancholia, there's a lot of anxiety, and often there's anger, and it's misplaced. It's anger at the partner, it's anger at the kids, it's anger at your boss. And really, what's going on is the way that sex played in one's life. If they had an active sex life, whatever that means for them, it's not for me to tell anyone what an active sex life is. But if you felt it was active, then it was. And
right.
How are things impacted when, or how is your sex life impacted when you can't get aroused and when you are mentally depressed, melancholic? First, look at what's changed, what shifted within you, within your desire, within your ability to feel like you're intimately connected with your partner. If you have a partner, or if you don't, then how you are intimately just connected with yourself. And then within the soul, are you feeling alone, a lack of connection, low desire, that you just kind of feel blank internally, that sense of boredom, drab, and nothing is inspiring you? That can look like grief as well. Now, look, there are a lot of external factors that can play into this, but what I know is that when people are feeling, fulfilled within a partnership or fulfilled sexually, even if they don't have a partnership, the depression, the anxiety can often dissipate, or at least not be as massively overbearing as it is when you're feeling cut off from a part of you that used to exist.
Yeah. Hi, it's Jessa. We're just going to take a quick pause here, or a little breather in the middle of the show. Thanks for listening so far. I'm wondering if you have a question that you want me to answer on a future episode. You can actually record a question for me at our website, bettersexpodcast.com. You're going to find the recorder on the footer of every page and on the side of the episode posts. And if I choose your question, I'll play it on the air and answer it as part of the show. I'd love to hear from you. So you alluded to, you said there are phases.
Yes.
Are those things you can sort of cover and go over with us?
Oh,
because
absolutely.
It seems like that's going to be a key towards people, if anybody who's listening who suffered a loss or is experiencing grief, what in the world do they do?
Right. So the whole idea of the phases is that you need to look at yourself, and as you are looking at yourself, know that you're going to be moving in and out of these phases. And I have kind of set out 11 phases of grief. And the first phase is what I call the emotional armor phase. And it's the go-to point. It's where you get yourself together. It's where you're numb. Maybe you're a little hysterical. You're protesting. You're in shock. And it is that first phase. And no matter where you are in these phases, and there's no initial order, you may always go back to emotional armor. You may always go back, because it's what protects you. It's where you land. It's where you start to feel safe. It's where you can be a gatherer of information. So that's like the first phase. The next phase is real confusion. Who am I in this? Like, what's happened to me? I used to be, this vibrant person, and now I feel so flat. I feel just like emotionally, psychically deadened. And I don't really know how to respond to the world or to myself with my lack of desire, with that sense that I am not in the kind of partnership that I want to be in, or that I yearn for a partnership, and I yearn to desire, and I can't do it. I just can't. And there's grief around that. And within grief, there is role confusion. Who am I? And then the 3 Ds, and the 3 Ds are disorganization, depression, and detachment. And, when you're trying to figure out what's going on, it's a very disorganizing experience. It's very disorganizing to be told, for a man, for example, you've got blockages in your heart. We really recommend that you eat better and start exercising. And it is right now affecting your ability to have an erection. And what we would like you to do is find alternatives until we can get this taken care of. And it's very disorganizing. If who you have been is, not necessarily a stud, but you've participated,
right,
in a loving way with your partner or girlfriend or boyfriend. And, it's a very disorganizing time, and that can lead to depression and ultimately detachment. Like, okay, you know what? The way I'm going to deal with this is I'm not going to deal with it. And that's about them. And it is a reaction that many people have, that sense of detachment, that sense of, I'm going to step back from this whole sex talk. I'm going to take a step back about my desire, and I'm going to shut down.
Yeah.
And I think there are more people, unfortunately, than not, that will, detach. By the time someone goes to you, Jessa, or comes to me, they've decided that detachment is not necessarily the way they want to be.
Yeah, exactly. They're coming out of that phase, and like we need to be talking about.
That's exactly right. And then the next phase is fear and anxiety, because whenever there's a change or a shift, or we've got to do things differently, there is fear and there is anxiety. Mm-hmm. But are you going to let the fear overtake you, or are you going to step into it? Because when you step into it, wow, there's a whole different relationship that you have with that anxiety and fear. Your relationship with anxiety and fear can change, and you can be the mastermind of it, or it can be in control of you. And that's what you need to decide. And this is a point where, sexually speaking, we're talking about finding alternatives and not being afraid of the alternatives.
Right.
And opening up your mind to, okay, so maybe I have limitations now. Let me work with these limitations. Let me try tantric sex or breath work, or let me try to move into myself and see what I need in terms of just myself. And then I can maybe talk to my partner or find a partner who will be willing to have this conversation.
Yeah, and there's sort of no way to move into that without anxiety.
That's exactly
right. This is outside of the comfort zone, and we have to sort of, I describe it as earning that comfort.
Yes.
And that's going to require being willing to be anxious.
That's right. And it's interesting that you say that, because in the book, I talk about making peace with it, and then, understanding that there's emerging anxiety, and what moderate anxiety feels like and what extreme anxiety feels like. And that you actually, anxiety and fear, there's not just one way of looking at it. It affects us in many different ways. And one day you can feel that extreme fear. If you step into it, if you take some risks, well, then you're really talking to it, and you're saying, you know what, you're not overtaking me. You're not doing that. Yeah. And I'm going to do this differently. And when we talk to ourselves and our souls and our spirits in that way, the anxiety, the relationship that we have with the anxiety and the fear really shifts. And when that shifts, I don't know if you found this, but your relationship to your sexual self also shifts.
Interesting way of putting that. Another thing I say to clients all the time, which is true, what we avoid, when we avoid what makes us anxious, the anxiety gets worse.
Yes.
And the way you're talking about it is our relationship with that anxiety, but it's the same phenomenon. If you lean in, step forward, all of a sudden you can master it. You can feel empowered.
That's right. And that moves us right into the next phase, which is anger, rage, and despair.
Oh.
And you can internalize it, or you can externalize it. And you can internalize your anger and your rage, or you can externalize your anger and your rage. And, there are constructive ways to kind of look at the anger. And when you constructively work with the anger, then your despair will dissipate. but you've got to really find constructive ways to move into your anger and be willing, again, to assess it and say, okay, like, what can I control? What can't I control? I might not be able to control my heart disease, or I may not be able to control in this moment the fact that maybe sex hurts and therefore my desire is diminished. But what I can control is I'm going to do exercises to desensitize myself, or I'm going to find alternatives with my partner, or I'm at least going to let my partner know what's going on with me.
Right.
Instead of just pushing my partner away.
Yeah.
No, I'm not doing this. And your partner is left in the dark. They have no idea what's going on. And this is often the case. And I try to really work with partners to say, this isn't about you. This is not your game. Yes, you can observe it, but take what's yours and leave the rest, Know what's yours. And, by shutting down, by going into despair, you become so quiet within the self and angry and angsty that really you're pushing everyone away. So this is a moment actually for you to look at the self and say, you know what? I don't have to let these circumstances interrupt who I am at my core. And if I'm a sexual being, then I am going to move through the grief of who I was and who I may not return to, but I'm going to find new ways to feel alive within my sexual self, if that makes sense. And then,
yes, it does.
Good. And then the next phase is regret and guilt and shame. And the shame piece is huge. And, shame is it's a very young emotion, but boy, if, we've been sexual beings since we're pretty young. And all of a sudden, if it's taken away or it's diminished, there is a sense of shame. And then again, that's why I call it the phases, because that sense of shame can go right back to leading us to detachment.
Right.
And lead us to despair. And so this conversation is about how you move through these phases, not just how you go from one phase to the other, because they're not finite.
Yeah, I get that, where you wouldn't just be done with one, and they're not sequential in that way.
That's right.
These are things you're going to sort of dance between, in the whole process.
That's right. And it is a dance. This is very much a dance. And how do you find fluidity in the dance? How do you find a way in to your partner or into yourself and finding, okay, what do I need? What am I hungry for? What am I willing to look at in terms of, like, I have a structure and I live by that structure. And it's a very fixed kind of personality. It's like, I'm fixed and this is the way I'm going to do things. And maybe it's about finding a more mutable way of working, and saying, I'm going to try to find my flexibility as I move through the grief of what's happened to me. And yes, it's external, but it's internal. And I understand that it's internal and I can do things differently. And then we move to sadness. And that sadness, you can live with sadness, and you can be sad about the fact that things are not the same. You can be sad, certainly, and melancholic that, your desire is not the same, or that, your body isn't what it used to be, and your stamina isn't what it used to be, and your partner may have changed over the years. And so what you used to know about one partner is now different. And so there's a learning curve, and there can be grief around that. And this sadness, when someone gets to a place of sadness, I'm like, good for you, because you can live with it.
Right.
You can live with that. And, the other piece of this, which is, I think, really important, is how much our brains are important in all of this. We talk to our brains, and our brains have the ability to be flexible, to be changeable. And even if we think that we're stuck in one way of thinking, if we tease our brains into thinking differently, and we continue to push ourselves beyond our comfort zones, guess what? The brain's going to change right along with us. And then your depression and your anger and the rage can all shift as well.
Yeah.
The next few phases really are about forgiveness of the self, forgiveness perhaps of those who might have hurt you or impacted your ability to really be free sexually. And those are, certainly important. The idea that you're going to be able to repattern and calibrate the self, and that's a goal. Like, find your balance and integrate what you've lost and move it into new growth, resolution, and then finding your grace. And grace is very active. It's finding your stability. It's finding the chance to say, you know what? Okay, so I'm not the same as I was, or my partner and I are at odds around this, but we can find a different resolution and a different conversation about this to make what is dead, what feels broken, and find a different puzzle and create all the different new puzzle pieces that will make this new puzzle whole again.
That's a lot. Just trying to take all that in and imagining. I was going to say, I guess grace is where you end up, but there probably isn't an end point, right? I would imagine you come in and out of phases of
That's
grace.
Right. That's right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And then, of course, our losses don't stop either. So
That's
just
right.
when we've worked through a lot of these phases about one thing, we're probably presented with another.
That's exactly right.
So, yeah.
Yeah. But what's interesting is that as you go through the grief and you see that you have survived it and you find the resiliency, that resiliency helps you the next time you're faced with grief, or the next big G that you're faced with, and even especially with the little G's. So that this process is really about learning the self. And once you can learn the self, whatever grief you're faced with, whether it is the loss of a loved one or it is the loss of the self that you once knew, that you actually have a conversation going on within the self that is so potent and powerful, and it leads to resiliency and sexual freedom.
Yeah, sometimes the other side is way better than where we started,
Absolutely.
Even with the loss. Yeah. So in wrapping up, would you talk just a little bit about how people can learn more about you, say a little bit more about the book that you've got coming out?
Certainly.
And, certainly I will put links in the show notes to everything, that you mentioned, but
that would be great. Thank you so much, Jessa. So the book, it's called It's Grief, The Journey of Self-Discovery Through Trauma and Loss. And it's coming out sometime in January, I would say late January. And I am a psychotherapist in private practice in New York City, and I work with grief, sex, and trauma. I'm a sex therapist and try to use the sex therapy working with many populations who are dealing with issues around sexuality, from gender issues to low desire to painful sex, and then how to go from the grief of that to finding your own puzzle pieces and normalizing all of it for the self.
Yeah. And I would imagine that on your website, you've got contact info.
Absolutely. And you can definitely contact me at edynathan.com. That's probably the best way to contact me.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me, Jessa. This was a wonderful show and great questions.
Great. Thanks.
You've been listening to Better Sex. Please visit our website, bettersexpodcast.com, for show notes and additional episodes.
Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the show. If you found that this episode resonated with you, I would love to hear from you. You can leave me a comment on the episode page. You'll find a link in the episode description. And if you've got time, again, please visit iTunes, subscribe to the podcast, And consider rating and reviewing the show. That's what helps other people find us. Thanks so much. See you next time.
Our theme music has been composed, recorded, and provided by Rick Ruskin, courtesy of Lion Dog Music.